Okay, good morning if you're here early. Nice to see you. I'm just going to set up a couple of things before we get going. Don't forget that you are very welcome to include yourselves in this. If you want to add a question or anything to the chat, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to set up a couple of things before 9 o'clock. Okay. And I will be sharing my screen as previously. There we go. And there we go. Okay, so let me talk you through what was happening yesterday. So yesterday, if you weren't able to be here, it should be on my channel. You should be able to see what we talked through. And I've cut off the beginning where you have to wait for ages for me to get sorted out. So you will be able to watch that back if you want to. But yesterday we looked at the first chapter. And the first chapter, if you remember, I'm sure you do, is the story of the door. And the story of the door is all about introducing Utterson as a character, as our main point of information. Everything that we as a reader discover in this book comes via the view of Utterson. So we've seen this in the story of the door. Utterson has been introduced as a character. We found out a bit about him as a character. And just to recap, what we want to do as we're reading this book is start to just build up some information about what it is that is happening and what it is that we're learning. So we've put down a couple of things already about Utterson, and I'm going to add a couple of other things as well. We know that he is a very moral person. We know he's presented as if he is the perfect sort of man, the sort of man who everybody should be like. This is Stevenson's idea of what counts as good in a person. We said he was self-denying. We said he was non-judgmental. We said he made friends who lasted. Remember, his best friends are not necessarily those he has most in common with. They're the people who've known longest. Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of him. And one of his closest friends is Enfield. Man about town, he's called, isn't he? And there's an implication to that. If you are a man about town in the late 19th century, he may be up to some fairly dubious things. The fact is that Enfield, when he tells his story, which we'll come to, he's walking around at 3 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, well-to-do people of good reputation in London in the late 1800s, generally they're at home tucked up in bed at that sort of time. And so we start to get a sense that he's maybe somewhere in this grey area of morality. We've also been introduced to Hyde, and we've been introduced to Hyde via Enfield, because Enfield tells Utterson the story of the door, and the door is the place where Utterson and place where Hyde runs over the little girl, and then he goes into the door and comes out with a check to make it all better. And we get a little bit of a sense of Mr. Hyde here as well. He is deformed. He brings out violent hatred in others. Now, you may have noticed on the board here, I've got a couple of pictures. I'm going to zoom in on this one first of all. This picture is a picture showing phrenology, which was a science in the 19th century, or considered a science. It was the belief that the shape of your head dictated your morality, your personality, your intelligence. You can see here we've got, for example, if this is particularly lumpy, then you might be very, very cautious. If, let's see, if this is lumpy, You might be very, very destructive, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, it's nonsense. Clearly, it's nonsense, but a lot of people took it very, very seriously. And since it is 9 o'clock, I'm going to just start again and say hello to anyone who's joining. This is day 2. If you missed yesterday, that's absolutely fine. It should be on the channel. You should be able to watch that back. But today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, which is the search for Mr. Hyde. Okay. And I've just been talking about some of the ideas that we got from chapter 1. And I'm just very quickly wanted to mention a couple of thematic things, contextual things that you may well be already aware of, but which help us understand the world in which Stevenson was living. And I'm talking about this thing, phrenology, the study of the shape of someone's head. It is completely mad. We know this now. We've passed all this, but a lot of people believe that shape of your head dictated what sort of person you were. Now, I've got next to this a photo of a chap who you may have heard of yourself. This is a guy called John Merrick, and I've put him on the board because his story really illustrates quite beautifully some of the beliefs that Victorian England had, and they had about appearance. Now, John Merrick, as you can see here, poor chap was born really severely deformed. You can see his sort of lumps on his face. There were deformities around the rest of his body as well. Very difficult for him to talk. A lovely, beautiful film made about him. I think it was John Hurt played him. He had an incredibly sad life, inevitably. And one of the things that happened to him was that he was put in a freak show. A freak show was what 19th century people did with those people who didn't conform to physical norms. They would be put in a freak show, and people would pay money to come and see the weird people with the lumpy head or whatever, the extra limb, whatever it was, whatever difference they had. Obviously now 21st century us will look at that and go, dear Lord, that's awful. And it was really awful. People made judgments about appearance. To appear like that in Victorian England was indicative to many of something fundamentally morally wrong with that person. John Merrick, by all accounts, was an absolute sweetheart. He was incredibly decent, very thoughtful, very interesting man who suffered awfully. And his very existence rather disproved this Victorian idea. But I wanted to mention him very briefly, just so that you got some kind of sense of the world in which we are looking at the moment. I'm going to go over now, and we're going to go and take a look at the search for Mr. Hyde. And as I did yesterday, I will be sort of highlighting things as we go. And I will be sort of looking out for character comments. I'll be, things we can say about the character. I'll be looking for things to do with, themes and that sort of thing. And I will check back every so often to see if there are any questions. I'll check back sort of halfway through to see if there are any questions coming up. So do feel free to put them in the chat. But we'll get started now. So this is the search for Mr. Hyde. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in sombre spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. And of course, sombre spirits after hearing this story from Mr. Enfield about Hyde trampling this girl and going into this house. It was his custom of a Sunday, when this meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighbouring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. And again, we've got more of this sense that he is a very good Christian moral man. This is how you're supposed to spend your Sundays, reading about God. Some dry divinity means it's a book about God and theology and Christ and that sort of thing. And go soberly to bed, so sensibly, without alcohol, that sort of thing. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. Now, I'm going to highlight this just for a moment, because another thing that comes up, a motif, if you like, a tool that Stevenson uses is letters and documents and papers. Those of you who are studying the Power and Conflict anthology with AQA, there's a poem in there called Tissue. And in that poem, as Darker talks about how bits of paper form the layers of our lives, the layers of our personality, if you like. And we can really see this in the way that this whole story is built up around wills and letters and checks, all this detritus, all this documentation that builds up together and makes a story. And sat down with a clouded brow to cover its contents. The will was holographed, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. We get a little bit of backstory here, don't we? It provided not only that in the case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, but that in the case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay and free from any burden or obligation beyond the pavement of a few small sums to the member of the doctor's household. Now then, let's just make sense of what we've just read. So we've got a will written by someone who we've not heard of before, Dr. Jekyll, in which he says if anything happens to him, all his stuff goes to Edward Hyde. And we know who Edward Hyde is because we've just heard of him. Now we start to see why Utterson's looking a little bit worried. The said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay and free from any burden or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. The document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him, both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And again, we've got a little bit here about the character of Utterson. He doesn't like fanciful, he likes things orderly. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. So he'd been suspicious about this before, but now he knows something about Hyde, that he likes trampling small girls. Now he's really worried about this. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name, of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mist that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped up the sudden, definite presentment of a fiend. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, and now I begin to fear it is disgrace. With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. Now then, we've got another person being introduced. So we know about Jekyll, simply that he has written a will and given it to Utterson. And now we've introduced Lanyon, who Utterson believes is a guy who knows his stuff. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. Here we get some more about Lanyon. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman. The red face generally means that he drinks too much, with a shock of hair prematurely white and a boisterous and decided manner. I'm going to highlight all this because this is helpful if we're trying to get a sense of who the guy is. At sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. These two were old friends, old mates both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and each other, and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. I suppose, Lanyon, said he, you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has. Interesting. So now we know that there's a little triangle of friendship. We have Utterson, we have Lanyon, and we have Jekyll. "Oh, I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon. "Well, I suppose we are, and what of that? I see little of him now." "Indeed," said Utterson. "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," was the reply, "but it was more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see, and I have seen devilish little of man. Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, "would have exchanged Damon and Pythias. Now then, Damon and Pythias, brothers, don't need to worry too much about it, but it's about two people who loved each other very much. So something has happened, something has gone on between Jekyll and Lanyon that has separated them. But we don't know exactly what it is. So we're going to put this down here. Hints at separation. And we're going to put due to fancifulness on the part of Jekyll. And of course, we know Utterson has no time for fancifulness and whimsy, and neither does Lanyon. And these are our good guys. Fancy and whimsy belong to someone else. This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They have only differed on some point of science, he thought, and being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, "It is nothing worse than that." He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure, and then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde?" he asked. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him. Since my time." That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro, until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling amid darkness and besieged by questions. Now, let's just pause there for a moment, because again, we get a little bit of a sense of Utterson here. He's asked questions. He wants to know more. He could have asked more, but he doesn't. And again, this kind of reflects on who Utterson is. You know, he allows his friends to go to the devil in their own way. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Now, it's always dangerous to make too much of questions of setting. But Utterson, our good guy, lives near a church, and I feel that's worth remarking upon. And still he was dealing with the problem. Hitherto it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination also was engaged, or rather enslaved. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night in the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in the scroll of lighted pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctors, and then these met, and that human juggernaut, look, he's borrowed that phrase, trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling at his dreams, and then the door of the room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. The figure in these two phrases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly, and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. Let's just pause again for a moment, because this whole section, this insight into what's happening in Utterson's mind. He is torturing himself. And this very Gothic kind of style of description here, state of mind, I'm going to put there, okay. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams, it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. And thus it was There sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of the will. At least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield the spirit of enduring hatred. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning, before office hours, at noon, when business was plenty and time scarce, at night, under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. There's something dog-like about this, isn't it? Where we use the word dogged when someone is really determined about something, don't we? And there's something like that about Utterson here. He has become, shall we call us obsessed or concerned about his friend, possibly even just nosy. So I'm going to put these different words down. Inquisitive. Now, all of these words could be used depending on how you feel about Utterson. Depending on whether you want to ascribe to him more positive characteristics or not, you might decide that he is more concerned and inquisitive. But if you think, actually, he's just being really nosy, we might go that and obsessed. And he says, if he be Mr. Hyde, thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And there we've got his mission, if you like. He's going to find out who Hyde is. And at last, his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary and, in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far, domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong, superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came, he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. Let's pause for a second, because again, we've got our Mr. Hyde here. And we've got this physical look of him, even went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. The sort of person that just puts you a little bit on edge. So, here we go. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. Mr. Hyde, I think. Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. Hissing intake. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You'll not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favour?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. "Will you let me see your face?" And that's a big question, isn't it? Because although we know that all he means really is, I want to be able to see you, there is a theme that is developing about things that are hidden and things we can see. Sometimes we don't really want to see the things that are hidden. They are hidden for a reason. What is behind that door may be horrific. Maybe we don't want to open it. Utterson digging into these secrets, he may well find out things he doesn't want to know. And equally, if he looks at Hyde's face, what is he going to see? Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde, "it is as well we have met. And apropos, you should have my address." And he gave a number of a street in Soho. Good God, thought Mr. Utterson, can he too have been thinking of the will? He kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By description," was the reply. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends," echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. "Who are they? Jekyll, for instance?" said the lawyer. "He never told you," cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. "I did not think you would have lied." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. I'm just going to get that snarled, savage. We've got that flush of anger. We're getting a sense of who this man is. The lawyer stood a while, when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to the brow like a man in mental perplexity. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of the class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. "There must be something else," said the perplexed gentleman. "There is something more. If I could find a name for it, God bless me. The man seems hardly human. Something tridolic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think, for, oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if I ever read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend." And here we have it. Here we have the absolute determination that Hyde is the embodiment of evil, certainly as far as Utterson is concerned. And remember, Utterson is effectively the embodiment of good. So Hyde presented embodiment evil. Round the corner from the by-street there was a square of ancient handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness, except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Paul?" I'm just going to quickly highlight Paul here, because Poole is, while a minor character, a significant one. "I will see Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall, paved with flags, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire, and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer. Let's just quickly notice bright open fire, comfortable, all these things that we can now start to associate with Jekyll. Here, thank you, said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. And this hall, in which he was now left alone, was a pet fancy of his friend, the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt, what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life. And in the gloom of his spirits he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. He was ashamed of his relief when Paul presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room door, Paul, he said. Is that right, when Dr. Jekyll is from home? Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir, replied the servant. Mr. Hyde has a key. Your master seems to repose a deal of trust in that young man, Paul, resumed the other musingly. Yes, indeed. Yes, sir, he do indeed, said Paul. We have all in orders to obey him. I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde, asked Utterson. Oh, dear, no, sir. He never dines here, replied the butler. Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory. Well, good night, Paul. Good night, Mr. Utterson. And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. Harry Jekyll, he thought. My mind misgives me he is in deep waters. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. Aye, it must be that, the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming, pedi Claudio. Years after, memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault, and the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension, yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided, and then by a return on his former subject he conceived a spark of hope. This Master Hyde, if he were studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own. Black secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. And here we're getting a little bit foreshadowing, aren't we? Because we know the truth, because we've read this before. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening! The danger of it, for if this Hyde suspects the inheritance of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. I must put my shoulder to the wheel if Jekyll will but let me, he added. If Jekyll will only let me. Once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as a transparency, the strange clauses of the will. Okay, so let's just take a look over here. And let's just think about what we have learned so far. So we've learned, first of all, we have met Lanyon. And we know that he is basically one of the good guys. We know that he is genial. We know that he has fallen out with Jekyll. We know that he is also a scientist. We know that there is a servant called Paul. And we know that Utterson is incredibly loyal, isn't he? Because Utterson is looking out for Jekyll, having seen that he's now involved with this man, Hyde. And Hyde, he brings out this violence, hatred. He is deformed. He is, interestingly, he's also a small man, worth noting. So we've got all this already. Now, I've put a few themes. There are countless themes. There are many more themes than this if you want to find them. But these strike me as the most important ones. And I just want to think about, well, what have we learned so far? So reputation, one of the most important things a Victorian and possesses. So if your reputation is at risk, then you risk everything. We've got some idea of morality, not being fanciful seems to be part of morality, doesn't it? We've got things to do with appearance, and we know that, for example, we've got things that are dark, are evil. We've got a door in the dark. We've got Hyde, seems to be quite dark. We've got as well this idea of mystery. What is behind the door? We've got those other questions as well. What is the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde? And we've got this word duality here, which we haven't absolutely hit upon yet, but we're starting to see lots of comparisons. We've got the busy, welcoming streets and rooms versus the dark doors and lonely streets where the evil happens. Remember, Jekyll's hallway is lovely and light and open, but where Hyde goes is dark and suspicious. Okie dokie. So that's the search for Mr. Hyde. We're going to stop here. I will be uploading this and saving this so that you will be able to watch this without having to go through all the kind of waiting time at the beginning. I'll be doing the same thing again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock when we'll look at chapter 3. If there is anything that you want to ask or anything that you want us to go over during this, then please do pop a message on the chat or feel free to contact me. You can find me at englishandhistorytutor.com or find me on Facebook under the same name. Have a lovely rest of the day